Welcome to Unsheathed 102. At least that's the number I'm going to go with. We are here with Kyell Gold,
Hi.
K.M. Hirosaki,
Hello.
and myself, Kit Silver. In this episode, we are going to review Unsheathed number 2, or reflect upon Unsheathed number 2.
Yeah.
Answer some of the questions that were asked in the episode, or re-answer.
Yeah, this was a trip down memory lane for me.
Could we go with the numbering episode -2? Sorry, I'm being a math geek. I'll stop.
Never stop being a math geek.
Talk about memory lane some more, KM.
I was going to say, you just made me realize there's a perfect affix for this unsheathed thing that they have in Japanese. We could be ura unsheathed, which is like the flip side half of something. It's kind of hard to explain. It's
Kind of like yin yang, but
and it's used a lot in fantastical context to refer to like like other like shadow versions or mirror versions of things, that kind of thing.
They do like their shadow versions.
Yeah.
We could be the upsheathed down.
It's also the term they use for like a secret menu, like ura menu. It's like the other menu,
the other sheath.
the other sheet.
In Blue Eye Samurai, which I was watching, which was a Netflix show, one of the episodes had a puppet show play, and so they had animated all of the figures holding and moving the puppets behind them, which was super cool.
That is cool. Yeah, no, I always love weird forms of performance like that are like translated from one medium to a different medium to kind of like reproduce the same effect.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes any sense, what I just said.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does.
Good.
So how was this a trip down memory lane? What did you remember?
This 18,000 word story of mine called Pressure, which upon seeing the name of it, like I was like, wait, I'm like, Pressure? I was like, what story of that even was that? And so I went back to look at it, and I'm like, oh yeah, this one. I vaguely remember writing this, and I basically like had to skim it very quickly because I didn't have time to read a third of a novel worth of text just to brush up on what it was. But a lot of people in the comments on So Furry really seem to like it. And they're like names of people I remember valuing the opinions of.
Even better.
You liked it too, apparently.
I did. I don't remember it clearly
Exactly.
now.
Yeah. No. It was. It's about this. He's a mongoose who has graduated college, and he's been like away for a few years, and he's like brought back by some of his old gay student union friends to take part in something, and it's all about like longing for a part of your life that's gone and over and isn't coming back, which is a theme in life I've had to deal with many times. I think we all do.
Yep.
Do you remember when you wrote that? Were you trying to explore any particular
Gosh, you know
challenge
what?
or aspect? Or?
I'm trying to remember what I was thinking when I wrote it, and like for the record, just in general, I have a terrible memory for the stuff that I wrote. I am sure there are like countless stories that are in my online archive right now that I could pull up and be like, I have no memory of having written this. But with this one, I recognize my voice in it very strongly. Gosh, like I'm not sure what inspired this one. I want to actually go back and read this one, actually, because what I was saying about it in the episode is, oh, I had like an idea for this quick 5,000 word short story, and then by the time I got to like the 1,000 word mark, and I'm like, oh no, this is going to be a lot longer. Which, credit to myself, that's pretty early on in the story to realize that you have that sort of issue to deal with coming at you.
I do remember that some years after this podcast, I would have a similar realization when I was writing the beginning of Camouflage.
Oh, yeah.
Except in my case, it was maybe a couple thousand words in, and I realized that I could either make this a 7,000 word short story, or I could make it a novel, and it all depended on what I wanted to have happen at this point. And then I was like, the short story would be very similar to many other short stories I've written, so let's see how the novel turns out. And it's still one of the novels that I'm very proud of.
Yeah, based on when I wrote Pressure, it sounds like to me that it was probably the last story of any substantial length that I wrote before I started writing Summerhill, which would go on to consume me for several years to come.
We'll have to discover which episode it was.
Yeah, it becomes a perennial discussion on the podcast at a point, but not yet at this point. I think I was smart enough to not mention that I was working on it yet.
No, I think in this episode you actually do allude to.
I allude to it. I allude
to
to having a secret project that I'm going to announce.
Was it that?
I think it was based on just the timing of it.
Wow. All right. Cool.
I can't think of anything else leading into. So, because it was. I would have been finishing up the Seventh Chakra because that got published in January of 2010.
I remember working on that with you.
Yeah, so that was probably coming to a close and wrapping up. And then I don't think Summerhill was released in 2013, I want to say. So we're still like half a decade out from that happening at this point in the podcast lore. So maybe it's not until a little deeper into the show that pops up.
I had a question, Ricky. You had mentioned that when you read Pressure, you kind of recognized your voice.
Yeah.
I guess I have two questions. One is, can you explain a little bit more what was it that you recognized in it that you recognized as your voice? And then the second question would be, nowadays, as you're doing translation from other languages into English, does your voice also come through that? Do you notice?
I think it definitely does. But so to get to the first part of that, the sort of third-person omniscient narrator in this story, as it does with a lot of stories, hangs out very close to the main character's head. So I'm not literally in his thoughts, but I'm sort of like the prose itself is kind of intermingled with the way that he's thinking, and there's a lot of glib dismissiveness in the way that this character thinks about things, and I think that's a trait that I give a lot of characters as a flaw, just because being dismissive of your own problems is a thing that when you're writing about people who have problems, they can't be too aware of them or you don't have a story yet, right? Like they need to realize that they have a problem at some point. So yeah, it's not like outright snideness, although I was looking through it and at certain points, like, okay, he does get actively snide. He uses a lot of like kind of like inward swearing languages, a thing, which is also very me. I swear a lot, for people who don't know, especially in real life. I'm one of those people who I have to be reminded that if I'm around children, I can't just drop F-bombs left and right. But that is how I talk and think in real life quite a bit. But yeah, so, and yeah, you were talking then about, does my voice come through in translation. So a good real world example for this is I translated a video game called 428 Shibuya Scramble for the Spike Chunsoft game that was ported over to English in 2018. I want to say it was because it was about 10 years after it was originally released, which I think was 2008. But it's a visual novel set in Japan, and rather it's not like an anime type deal. Like it's set in like the real world with like actual photo and film imagery to sort of form it. And there are a series of tips. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of things that are hyperlinked in the text that either provide additional information about a certain thing that's being mentioned. Sometimes it's just there to make a joke. And then like sometimes it's just stuff like, here's an etymology lesson of this one obscure word that's being used. And like there's this very dry sense of humor, like that's just very deadpan and like surface level, just it's a very to me naturally funny way to deliver information. And it's one of those things where like I felt like I kind of shared whoever wrote these tips. I felt I shared their voice, and I was like, this is 100% my sense of humor. And so those were like one of the most fun parts of the game to translate, and it's one of the things that I've gotten the most commentary on from people saying like, oh, like I love the tips, like the voice that you use for the tips is like really strong. And I'm like, thank you, like I worked really hard on that. So yeah, I like to think that a lot of people seem to I had a reputation as being like the sort of misery writer. It came up, I was reading reviews of my story in X, and it's just like, oh, here comes good old K.M. Hirosaki, not disappointing in the moral quandary and like horrible people department. It's like, yeah, that's me. That was me. I did a lot of that. Kyell, you were always more about like, I just want to write about people falling in love and having good lives together. And I'm like, this is about sad people who are getting sadder.
I would get people complaining early on because a lot of the feline characters in my books ended up dead, and so I tried to fix that later on. But yeah, the Vol trilogy, is not depressing per se, but
there's sad moments.
They go through some shit.
It's pretty dark. Like, and remembering where the series originated in that 2-part short story originally.
Yeah.
It was pretty grim. And even then you turned it around and made it into something warm and happy.
Right. I mean, the happiness means more if you come out of a grim place to it.
The new equilibrium is a little bit better.
Yes.
Right.
That's a good way to put it.
I always found that your stuff, Kyell, always did, for the most part, you have exceptions, but for the most part, always had that element of hope, kind of something that it could potentially get better, if not outright getting better. And Ricky, yours, on the flip side, I never saw yours as like the opposite of that, because it was never like, I don't know, Russian and its direness.
No.
But it was more just, and the equilibrium was almost the same as it was when it started, maybe slightly less or better. But
I was very big on trying to see the beauty in tragedy.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
just telling a story that meant something, and like maybe it conveyed some sort of moral lesson, or it's like, maybe it's like, hey, have you ever accidentally done something really terrible to somebody that you cared about? You know, that sort of thing, where, like, sometimes the only lesson that you can take away is, well, you did that, and now you have to live with the consequences. But, like, you know, like, you can touch onto positive things with those themes, like healing and forgiveness, and not just betrayal and misery and, you know, corruption. Like, I don't think I ever wallowed in misery, although I would drag my my paintbrush through that inkwell on a lot of occasions.
You're like a Grant Morrison comic book character who would say, "Yes, I had to murder all of these butterflies, but look how pretty they are."
It sounds like a song by The Cure if you run it through a spectrum analyzer. I listened to a non-zero amount of The Cure while writing there was a period in my life where that was the thing that I did a fair bit.
And he's still touring.
Oh gosh, really?
Yep.
Yeah, we saw him last year.
Touring again this year. So the original episode was of this episode was number 2 was August 1st, 2009. So that was actually the same year that Out of Position was published, and that was January 2009.
Wow.
So kind of going back to what you guys are talking about is like Ricky, some of your character stories, they're short stories, and this person is in this equilibrium where they have to deal with what they had. But what I find interesting about Out of Position is that you have had a chance to revisit those characters over the years. You know, one of the publishers was joking is that they've actually been around so long that it's under 3 different publishers now, but their journey has lasted a long time. So you've actually had a chance to see those characters go through real changes over a period of time. Even though real time it's been 12 years, book time when was Out of Position to Titles? That was about 10 years actually. So
it's 10, I think. Yeah, I think Titles is 2019 if I recall.
So it'd be interesting, Ricky, to go to some of your characters like that were in Pressure. How would that character be?
Yeah,
what do they do? Where are they now?
Where are they now?
Yeah, my character Gareth the Coyote, who like shows up in a handful of stories. He eventually shows back up in my Raylan Sadakoi stuff.
Oh yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
That's where I know him. That's where I remember him from.
Yeah, and then there's a piece of art where my Ricky Fox persona from back then, before he got all antlered and stuff, was intentionally drawn as being really insecure about topping, which is funny because life changes.
Speaking of blowjobs, no. So that was
we have to stay on brand.
That was the first reference to blowjobs, I think. So we did have some questions that came into that original podcast. We had 3 questions.
Yeah.
We have about 10, 15 more minutes. Let's re-ask those questions and then see what answers, if they've changed at all since originally.
Hopefully, don't
all right.
Cool with that.
Sure.
There are 3, so let me ask the first one. This came in from Xerxes Otter. If handwritten in a notebook with medium to small handwriting, how long do you think a story should be?
If a train leaves Cleveland bound for Toledo, traveling at 70 miles an hour. No, when I was revisiting this episode, and I had the response of, I think any story should be as long as it needs to be, which feels like a glib and snide response, to go with that voice thing earlier. But I don't mean it that way, and I still do actually agree with that. I think that it's like, how long should a story be? It's like, how long does it take the story to tell? Like it's not your story doesn't get more or less points if it's a different length. Although I guess for submission guidelines, it could matter. But at that point, learn how to write a story of a particular length. It's a skill you develop with time. In fact, that was one of the most fun skills I had developing over those years. is because I remember I quote unquote got into short story writing because I could never finish like any of my attempts at novels, and I'm like, well, I guess I can write short stories instead. And then it's just like, oh wait, these can be as good. They're just different. And I found that I had, different feelings and experiences about writing 3,000 word stories versus 5,000 word stories versus 18,000 word stories. They all felt very different and involved different techniques and whatnot, and it would feel good to be on the money for that. And then in times, like I said, like in the episode itself, this is a story that I intended originally to only be 5,000 words long, and I was like, well, by the 1,000 word point, I already knew it needed to go deeper. And so, I mean, there's certainly something to be said about a length of a story not being what you need or what you necessarily want, but if that's still what the story calls for, I think I wouldn't do the story a disservice of trying to make it a different length to fit something. If you needed to write something for like a spec of a certain length, I would just try to write a different story that was that length at that point.
Yeah, so my original answer was talking about a short story is about a point in time, about an incident or a single moment that changes a character or changes a life. And so the length of a short story really depends on how much context you feel you need to or want to put around that moment.
Yeah.
You can make a story shorter by stripping out some of the context, but in science fiction and fantasy and furry, a lot of times people are there for extra context. They want to know more about the world you're putting your story in because you're creating this world. So it's easier for me to do short stories in, say, the out of position world because people are already familiar with that. I don't have to go through the whole thing about how this is a world that has animal people and also Starbucks. But I found that if I'm writing a short story in a new world that I haven't created before, I tend to write to about the 9,000 to 10,000 word length. And the furry anthology markets that I've seen are pretty good about allowing up to 10,000 words. And I think that's because they realize that when people are writing a short story for a furry market, you want a little more context around a moment. You're not just writing a story that anyone can pick up, and it's not like I'm writing a story about our contemporary world, so I don't have to tell you anything about, except like Joe was unemployed and was facing the prospect of getting kicked out of his apartment, and then that's a paragraph and everyone can relate to Joe now, and you don't have to know anything else about the world.
You've also kind of got the fact that when it comes to consuming furry media, furries are willing to commit. Like, we're willing to take the steps to find things that, match with our interests. And so it's like sticking around for a longer short story is not the worst thing to ask the audience to do, with our kind, as it twere.
Yeah, exactly. But on the whole, I 100% agree. The story is however long it needs to be.
Unrelated but related, fountain pens have had a big weird resurgence recently in my I guess Blue Sky feed. Neil Gaiman was talking about using them, and then Kyell just sent me a super cute little commercial from
Wes Anderson did a commercial for Mont Blanc fountain pens with Jason Schwartzman and a couple other people in it, and it's really cute.
Oh, okay.
It was very, very much him and his style. So for those of you out there who continue to write in notebooks, good on you.
Yeah. And if you're successful enough to afford a Mont Blanc fountain pen, congratulations.
Congratulations. All right.
I do want to say one one extra thing, because Xerxes did ramble a little bit before getting to their question, where they said, I enjoy what I do, but I never feel that my stories are good enough to post no matter what others say about them. And I think we do say this in the episode, but I just also wanted to reiterate, you're the one who gets to decide if other people see your story. And so if you don't think it's good enough to post, I'm not going to tell you to post it. However, you are also sometimes the harshest judge of your own work. And if other people are enjoying it, then maybe you should consider that there is something there that you're too close to it to see. And that perhaps it is worth posting if other people are getting enjoyment out of it. It's a tough place to be in. That place where you're far enough along to recognize where your stories are falling short, but not far enough along to actually get to the place you want to be. But I would encourage you to be stubborn and at least somewhat confident in your own work.
Yeah. There was a period for several years on my end where I had a very troubled and negative relationship with my own creative work. But I think that's a longer discussion to be had at a different point.
You pulled down a whole suite of your stories, too, because you weren't happy with them.
I did a lot of stuff that was very reactive towards not being happy with my stuff. I even wrote a really weird avant-garde stream of consciousness piece called Everything is Spiders. And I didn't tell anyone what it meant. It's up there. You can read it still.
Is that on So Furry?
It's on Fur Affinity. It's under my Rikoshi account. It's called Everything is Spiders. It's from about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I want to say. But yeah.
All right.
But
we'll visit that in our next episode.
Yeah. But for now, what was the second question that we were asked in this episode, Mr. Silver?
Second question by Pyro Stinger or PJ Wolf. Have you ever
or Furnace Hemingway, as we also knew him?
Oh my God. Longtime contributor and listener to the show.
Yes.
Pyro Stinger. Furnace Hemingway. Gosh.
Let's see. Have you ever dealt with the fear of the blank screen? And are there any tips for overcoming it?
The blank screen fear is real. I have found that really the only tip for overcoming it is know what you want to write about before you sit down in front of your computer. It's not going to just come to you in the moment. I mean, it might, but it probably won't.
It will. It'll just take longer and it'll be more frustrating. And if you're setting aside a specific window of time to write, then it feels very counterproductive to take up a bunch of that time just thinking about what you're going to write. It's nice that even back in 2009, I was already telling people, think about what you want to write before you sit down to write it, because that's one of the things that has stayed consistent in my writing advice over the years.
Yeah, I think it's really the strongest piece of advice. Like, be thinking about what you want to do. Be thinking about what you want to have happen. Consider your characters' motivations. Imagine them having conversations with each other. And, like, do that over and over again. Like, allow yourself to change your mind if you come up with a better idea. That's how you come up with better ideas, is by looking back at what you already have and coming up with something that you like more. Which, sounds like I'm asking you to just develop the superpower of knowing what you want to do, which is actually extremely difficult. It's really tough to know what you want to do sometimes, with regardless to writing or basically anything.
Yep.
But it is a skill, and it's also a thing where you can get into good habits for it. Like, putting yourself in a place where you are able to, even if you do need to just pop open a blank screen and come up with something on the fly. I mean, like, that's something you can get better at. I wound up needing to do a short fiction piece semi recently, and I was just kind of making it up as I was going along, and then I was like, oh, wait a minute, hold on, like, there's something here. And I was like, okay, well, let me go back and change a couple of the things that don't fit with what I've decided is going on here. And I'm like, oh, all right, this actually has kind of a neat little groove.
Yeah. One of the other things I recommend is, at the time, was just write down anything. Look out your window and write what's happening out the window, which reminds me of that SNL sketch about Tracy Chapman. But so I don't know if I would quite give that advice again, but I do think that what that's getting at is the fear of a blank screen comes from self-created pressure that whatever you write has to be good, it has to be right, it has to be the worthy start to your story. And I think getting out of that mindset is one of the keys to overcoming this fear of a blank screen. And that one of the things that I'm sure, talked about even back then was your first draft is allowed to suck.
Yeah.
And
sometimes even your second draft.
And so if you don't look at the blank screen as the place where your perfect story must materialize, but it's just, hey, it's just where you're going to scribble down the thoughts that you will eventually shape into the story, then without that pressure, I feel like the blank screen is easier to handle.
Yeah.
I just started a new gay furry sport book, and
Guess.
I know, right? And I like sent the first chapter out through my Patreon and everything, and then I was thinking about it today because I'm also writing this craft book on how to write a novel. And I was like, did I follow all my own advice for the first chapter of this book in terms of introducing the character? I'm not sure I did. Oh, well, I'll go back and revise it, and then it'll be fine. And the Patreon people get to see a first draft so they can see how it improves from first draft to revision and editing. But the point is, it got done, and something's out there, and I discovered a new plot line for the book in just writing the first paragraph. Or first chapter, not paragraph. So if you can kind of set aside that pressure and just write something fun, like obviously you want to write a story.
Yeah.
So just start writing the story. It doesn't matter if the beginning is good or not. You're going to change it. You're going to edit it, but just do the fun part.
Yeah. Get it down so that you have something to work on, because unless you're somebody for whom your mind works particularly well in this fashion, just kind of having a vague idea in your head is not the same thing as having words in a file somewhere.
Right. But also that there's this intermediate step between the vague idea and the writing idea, and then the first draft writing, and then the final draft. Like, those are all stages in a process.
Yeah.
And the vague idea becomes kind of words that have a shape, but it's not necessarily the right one. And it doesn't have to be.
I like that. Looking for the pretty words, carving out the pretty words.
Yes.
I had one comment on this one as well. You were talking about just a little bit, just getting in the practice of writing. I saw somebody reference recently, kind of the same sentiment, but working out, where basically they were able to get to the point where it's like, or anybody who's doing something consistently should get to the point where you're having fun. It's something you're looking forward to, and you can get to that point. So it's not like, oh, I have to write again. It's like, I'm looking forward to this 30 minutes of writing. It's like, I'm treating myself with it. I know, Kyle, you get a bit cranky if you don't get your you're writing in. So
I do.
You have reached that point where it's kind of like, no, I look forward to this time when I'm actually doing the writing. So that is another thing. If you practice, you'll get there.
And you get more efficient with your writing too. Whenever I go through and edit, I find some little writing tick that I'm doing that bugs me. And like, I forget which of the filler words it is at the moment. I think it's just. But at one time it was like very or really that were just.
I had my comma then comma phase.
Yeah.
Where I just had things that connected as like comma then comma, and it's just and then I started seeing it everywhere in my writing, and it's like, stop doing that.
And then what happens is when you've done that enough times, you will be writing a first draft and you'll type out the word really, and then you'll say, nope, I'm going to just take that out in edits, so I'm just going to take it out right now. And you get more efficient with your first draft when you've done a few edit passes and you know what some of these ticks are.
Yeah.
And you never get rid of all of them. You get new ones. But yeah.
Okay. Last question, and I am also paraphrasing these questions. I think you brought that up in the last one. The people who have written in the past have usually, added a paragraph or two before the actual question often. But I've not been reading those, so I'm going to continue to just kind of cut down to what the regular, the main question was. But I do recommend people, we will post the transcripts online, or you could go back and listen to the old podcast if you want to get the full context. This one, question was, what books do you recommend to help with grammar and spelling? And then the second part was, if someone pays me to write something because they like my work, should I do it like I would, or should I do it like their character would?
Well, I know that both of us have at times been paid by people to write things according to their personal spec. I don't think either of us was ever at a point of, I'm open for commissions, because we would not have survived trying to do that at the time, I don't think. But I know we've done, cash for story turnarounds at points. So for that last part, obviously they're paying you for your writing and your writing style. But, if there's elements that they specifically want you to include, or if there's things that they want to happen a certain way, and that's what they're paying you to do, do that.
Yeah, I'm trying to find what I wrote.
I know in the past, Kyell, you've talked about some of the earlier commissions you had taken in. It was interesting hearing you talk about the language you learned for perhaps specific interests they wanted to make sure were included. So it was kind of learning more about kind of the nuances of certain interests that you may not have known, just being aware it existed, but nothing else. So kind of that learning of the language is probably something that was interesting, I imagine.
Yeah, the place where it depends, I think, on the commissioner, and I didn't say this at the time, but I think my answer would be, that's a question for your commissioner.
Yeah.
Anytime that I've done a story for money, they have given me all the parameters they wanted included in the story, and the rest was up to me.
Yeah.
And we did not, infinite back and forth, but I definitely did send them a draft, and they would respond and say, oh, I'd like this scene to be longer, or they never didn't like anything, but they would want some things emphasized more than others, or they would think, oh, this is going in a different direction, or something like that. But keeping a dialogue open with your commissioner, I think, addresses most of those issues.
As for what do I recommend for help with spelling. Learn a language other than English that has spelling rules that make sense. No.
Learn Turkish. Everything's just spelled phonetically in Turkish. They don't have spelling as a class in Turkish schools.
Yeah, like the idea
I understand.
Yeah.
I may be wrong about that.
Like they don't really have spelling in Japanese either. It's like, no, it's just you write those sounds. That's what it is. And then eventually it's you write that ideograph that is unrelated to how it's pronounced.
But I think we talked about Strunk and White. Strunk and White is a decent, basic grammar and style book. And I think reading professionally edited publications.
Yeah.
Because nowadays I don't want to just say read a lot of stuff, because you'll end up reading somebody's blog post
or some AI generated
garbage. But read a professionally edited book and look at how they use language. Wiktionary is pretty good for spelling.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you have Microsoft Word's grammar checker is actually really good at identifying places where you want to double check and make sure you're doing the right thing. It catches comma problems, I would say, with 90% accuracy. It'll say, like, it's better not to have a comma between these phrases, or there should be a comma here, and most of the time it's right.
Yeah. Another resource that this is something that pops across my own feed every so often, and I look at it because it's fun and language related, is language-related content. There's a subreddit, I think it's just called English Learners, and people like ask questions like, hey, why do you have to say this instead of this? And like somebody is there, like people love to explain why things are a certain way if it's something that they're knowledgeable about, I've noticed. And so like this is one of those cases where like the internet like comes together to not just do garbage to people.
Man, the whole order of adjectives thing blew my mind when it came out.
It's like the fine little like silver French soup spoon or something.
Right. Yeah, for those who aren't familiar with it, there's a definite order that different categories of adjectives go into in English.
And you've never been taught this. Nobody ever taught you to do this.
But if you have read a lot of English, you instinctively understand why saying the silver little fine fork sounds wrong.
Yeah. In Japanese, you would say the blue big house. And that sounds insane in English for no real reason. And it's like, no, it's the big blue house. It has to go big then blue. Like, otherwise you're a maniac.
Right. and
then like
so,
I had a Japanese speaker go, well, why does it have to be the other way around? And I'm like, that's just how it is.
Yeah, because otherwise it's wrong.
Yeah.
And I guess my point about bringing up the order of adjectives is, if we can all learn something that arbitrary and complicated just from assimilation, then you should be able to pick up a lot of grammar just from assimilation, from reading. Like, does the thing you're writing sound like something you would have read? Commas are a whole different thing. It's funny you talk about comma splices in this episode.
Yes.
And I was like, could you define them for our readers, please? Because I wasn't sure what a comma splice was. And it's only been a few years that I think I feel actually confident about where I'm using commas. It's such a weird esoteric thing.
Yeah.
Because there's grammar rules, which is how the written word should look. But then we also get taught a comma is a pause in a sentence.
Yeah.
And so people tend to write commas where they want people to pause in a sentence, and then it's grammatically wrong by the written word.
Exactly. Yeah, it's an oversimplified explanation that winds up not helping. Kind of like I before E except after C, which is wrong more often than it is right. It turns out like it's a mnemonic that isn't even useful because it's mostly not correct.
Well, yeah, and it's true. I think what happens is when you are reading aloud, you pause when you come to a comma.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you put a comma everywhere you want the reader to pause.
Yeah, no, it has to. There's a lexical place that they need to go.
And Dark End was the one who was editing one of my manuscripts 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and was just like, "There's so many commas in the wrong places here," and I said, "What are you talking about?" And that was educational.
All right, that was interesting. All right, we ran about 45 minutes, so I think it's a good chance for us to kind of wrap this up.
Yeah, let's wrap it
A lot
up.
of good stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more of these.
Yeah.
Getting back into the vibe.
Yep.
With some audience.
We'll worry about that. We'll just put out awesome stuff and
I mean,
doing it for ourselves, really.
These will be exciting because people, unless they were like listening right at the beginning, have not heard the first 5 or 6 episodes.
Oh God, yeah,
because they're not on the feed.
They were like lost content even back in the day.
I'm embarrassed to say I not embarrassed to say I found them. I did find them clearly and was able to transcribe them. I'm embarrassed to say when I looked at the files, and I don't know if it's just that the software's gotten better or not, but I was like, oh, this is how I could have fixed it so it actually sounded better. So maybe we will put these back up online now that I've had a chance to play with them.
Cool.
All right. Well,
Thank you,
thanks,
Mr.
everyone.
Silver.
Until next time.
So long.
All right. Otter out.